America has given Israel over $300 billion, more than any country in history. This is how it started. There is no relationship in modern geopolitics quite like the one between the United States and Israel. America has provided Israel with more foreign aid than any other country on earth. It has used its veto at the United Nations dozens of times to shield Israel from international condemnation. It has supplied weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic cover through wars, invasions, and crises that horrified much of the world. To its supporters, it is the most important alliance America has. To its critics, it is the most costly and unconditional one. But how did it begin? Why did the most powerful nation on earth attach itself so completely to a tiny country that didn't even exist before 1948? The answer is not simple, and it is not what most people think. This is part 1, how America and Israel became inseparable from the birth of the state to the end of the Cold War. It is May 14th, 1948. The British mandate over Palestine officially expires. In Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stands before a crowd and reads aloud a declaration of independence. The State of Israel is born. 11 minutes later, the White House releases a statement. The United States of America recognizes the State of Israel, first in the world, before anyone else. Inside the administration, it had been a fierce internal battle. Secretary of State George Marshall, one of the most respected men in America, was so opposed to the decision that he told President Truman directly, "If you do this, I will vote against you in November." For Marshall, recognizing Israel meant alienating the Arab world, losing access to Middle Eastern oil, and handing the Soviet Union an opening in the region. Truman did it anyway. Why? Part of it was personal. Truman had been shaped by the Bible since childhood. He claimed to have read it twice before starting school, and he believed deeply in the Jewish people's historical connection to the land. His closest friend, a Jewish businessman named Eddie Jacobson, had spent months quietly lobbying him. And Truman had seen the evidence from the Holocaust with his own eyes. The displaced persons camps, the survivors with nowhere to go. Part of it was political. 1948 was an election year. American Jews were a significant voting bloc. His advisors were clear. Recognition would help at the ballot box. And part of it was moral. Truman simply believed it was the right thing to do. But there is a side to this founding moment that American history often glosses over, and that Palestinian history never forgets. At the same moment that Israel was declaring independence, the land that Israel was being founded on was not empty. For centuries it had been home to a predominantly Arab, Muslim and Christian population, farmers, merchants, families, living in towns and villages across the region. They had not been consulted about the partition of their homeland. They had not agreed to it. When Israel declared independence, 5 Arab armies invaded, backing the Palestinian Arab population who rejected the new state. What followed was a brutal war that lasted months. Cities shelled, villages fought over, atrocities committed on multiple sides. When the fighting ended, the map had been redrawn completely. Israel controlled far more territory than the UN partition plan had originally allocated, and the human cost was staggering. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians, over 80% of the Arab population in what became Israel, had fled or been expelled from their homes. More than 400 towns and villages were destroyed or depopulated. Palestinians call this the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe. This is not a contested fringe narrative. Israeli historians, including those Israeli Defense Forces, documented it in detail once Israeli military archives were opened in the 1980s. The people were real, the displacement was real. Many of their descendants still live in refugee camps in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon and Syria today. 3 generations later, still stateless. America recognized the state. America celebrated the birth. But America never reckoned with what that birth cost the people who had been living there. That silence shaped everything that came after. Through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, America's relationship with Israel was complicated. In 1956, Israel, acting in secret coordination with Britain and France, invaded Egypt after President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. It was not a defensive war. The 3 countries had met secretly in France and colluded on a plan. Israel would invade. Britain and France would intervene under the pretense of separating the forces and seize back the canal. President Eisenhower was furious. He had not been told. His closest allies had deceived him. He forced all three countries to withdraw, threatening to cut off all American aid to Israel and joining a UN General Assembly resolution formally deploring the Israeli occupation until they backed down. This was not the behaviour of an unconditional ally. The problem was the Cold War. The Soviet Union, locked in a global struggle with America for influence and power, had begun arming Egypt. Under President Nasser, Egypt was positioning itself as the leader of Arab nationalism, and it was leaning toward Moscow, Syria too, Iraq. The entire Arab world was becoming a Cold War battleground. America's strategic priority in the Middle East was not Israel. It was oil. It was keeping Soviet influence out of the region. And to do that, American policymakers believed they needed Arab allies. Israel complicated that. Every arms shipment to Israel risked pushing Arab countries closer to Moscow. Every show of support for Israel antagonized the nations that sat on top of the world's oil reserves. So through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, America tried to walk a tightrope, quietly sympathetic to Israel, but unwilling to make it a formal strategic partner. Then came June 1967, and the tightrope snapped. In May 1967, the Middle East tips toward catastrophe, partly responding to false intelligence reports from the Soviet Union, claiming Israel was massing troops on Syria's border. Egypt's President Nasser then masses Egyptian troops in the Sinai, expels United Nations peacekeepers, and closes the Straits of Tiran, Israel's only southern shipping route. Jordan and Iraq signed defense pacts with Egypt. The rhetoric from Arab capitals is of annihilation. Israel feels encircled. President Johnson pleads for restraint. He tries to build an international coalition to force the straits back open. It goes nowhere. After meeting with Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, Johnson reportedly says, "I've failed, they'll go." On June 5th, Israel goes first, launching a surprise airstrike that destroys most of Egypt's air force while the planes are still on the ground. Within 6 days, Israel captures the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. It roughly doubles its territory. The Arab armies, backed by Soviet equipment, are routed. Now here is where historians genuinely disagree, and it matters. The Israeli narrative, and the dominant Western one, is that this was a preemptive strike by a country facing imminent destruction. The Egyptian threat was real, the rhetoric was genocidal, and Israel had no choice. But a significant group of serious historians, including Israeli ones, dispute this. Former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin said in a 1982 speech, "The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him." Former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin told a French newspaper, "I do not think Nasser wanted war. The 2 divisions he sent to the Sinai would not have been sufficient to start an offensive against Israel. What is not in dispute? The Egyptian threat was real in terms of blockade and rhetoric. What is disputed, whether Israel faced actual imminent invasion or whether it chose a war that served strategic and territorial objectives. The occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, remain contested or occupied to this day, 57 years later. That is the direct consequence of those 6 days. For America, the strategic calculation was unmistakable regardless of who was right. Israel had just proven itself to be the most militarily capable country in the Middle East. It had smashed Soviet armed forces without a single American soldier involved. The Cold War logic reversed overnight. Israel was no longer a liability that antagonized Arab nations. Israel was a strategic asset, a powerful, dependable partner in a volatile region. Israel was no longer just a moral commitment. It was a strategic investment, and Washington began to act like it. 6 years later, in October 1973, Israel nearly loses everything. Egypt and Syria, humiliated by 1967, launch a surprise attack on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Israeli forces, caught completely off guard, take catastrophic losses in the first days of fighting, tanks destroyed, positions overrun. For the first time since 1948, Israel's survival is genuinely in doubt. Inside Israel's government, Prime Minister Golda Meir authorizes the assembly of nuclear warheads and makes them visible, a signal to Washington that Israel might be approaching a point of last resort. Richard Nixon receives the message. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, says plainly, Without our airlift, Israel would be dead. On October 12th, Nixon makes his decision: send everything that will fly. What follows is the largest emergency military resupply in American history. Hundreds of flights, over 22,000 tons of weapons, tanks, artillery and ammunition, delivered directly to a country in active combat. The tide of the war turns. Egypt's advance is halted. Israeli forces cross the Suez Canal. The Soviets, watching their Egyptian and Syrian clients get beaten back, threaten to send their own military forces to intervene. Nixon raises the American military alert to DEFCON 3, the highest level of readiness since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets back down. America and the Soviet Union had just come to the edge of direct military confrontation over a war in the Middle East. The message was now carved in stone. America's security and Israel's security were linked. An Israeli defeat was an American defeat. But the war had consequences beyond the battlefield. The Arab oil states, furious at America's airlift, imposed an oil embargo. Petrol prices in America surged, in some measures nearly quadrupling overnight. Queues stretched around petrol stations. The American economy was shaken. America had committed to Israel, and was now paying the price at home. The question was no longer whether to back Israel. The question was how to manage the costs of doing so. Kissinger understood something from the Yom Kippur War that others had missed. The real threat to America was not Israel. It was the cycle: wars, oil shocks, Soviet exploitation of Arab anger, more wars. The only way out was peace. He began what became known as shuttle diplomacy, flying back and forth between capitals, chipping away at the positions of Egypt, Syria and Israel. He negotiated disengagement agreements. He laid the groundwork. Then in 1977, the world is shocked when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat steps off a plane in Tel Aviv and addresses the Israeli parliament directly. For an Arab leader, the leader of the largest Arab country, the country that had fought Israel 4 times, to stand in Jerusalem and say, "I want peace," it was extraordinary. President Carter seized on it. In September 1978, Carter invites Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to Camp David. For 13 days, Carter personally mediates between 2 men so incompatible they refuse to sit in the same room. For the last 10 days, Carter physically shuttles between their separate cabins, carrying proposals, counter-proposals, redrafts. On September the 17th, the Camp David Accords are signed. In March 1979, Egypt and Israel sign a full peace treaty, the first between Israel and any Arab nation. Egypt recognizes Israel. Israel withdraws from the Sinai. The longest-running state of war in the Middle East is formally ended. For America, this was the strategic payoff. Egypt, once a Soviet client, once Israel's primary military threat, was now dependent on American military aid and aligned with the West. But there is a part of Camp David that history tends to leave out. The Accords included a framework for Palestinian autonomy, a promise that the Palestinian people living under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza would be granted self-governance. It was supposed to be the beginning of a political process that would eventually address their rights and their future. It never happened. Jimmy Carter himself wrote in 2006, "The Israelis have never granted any appreciable autonomy to the Palestinians, and instead of withdrawing their military and political forces, Israeli leaders have tightened their hold on the occupied territories." Sadat was assassinated 3 years later by Egyptian extremists who considered the peace a betrayal. His death showed how dangerous it was to make peace. But the treaty held. The Palestinian promise did not. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he had no ambiguity about where he stood on Israel. Reagan saw the Middle East entirely through the lens of the Cold War. The enemy was the Soviet Union. Israel was a unique strategic asset. His words, "a dependable ally in an unstable region." In November 1981, Reagan signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Israel, a formal strategic cooperation agreement. Intelligence sharing was expanded. Weapons sales increased. Israel was, in all but name, a full military partner. Then in June 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. The stated aim was to destroy PLO forces who had been launching attacks into northern Israel. But the invasion went far beyond that. Israeli forces advanced all the way to Beirut. The city was besieged, civilian casualties mounted. The world watched and recoiled. Reagan himself was appalled. He made an angry phone call to Prime Minister Begin, using the word Holocaust deliberately to describe the bombing of Beirut, a word that stung Begin deeply. Reagan recorded it in his own diary that night. I used the word Holocaust deliberately. Reagan cut off certain weapons transfers. He allowed 21 United Nations resolutions critical of Israeli behavior to pass without an American veto, something no subsequent president has come close to matching. And then, in September 1982, came Sabra and Shatila. Israeli forces had surrounded 2 Palestinian refugee camps on the outskirts of Beirut, Sabra and Shatila. They then allowed Christian Phalangist militias, Lebanese allies of Israel, to enter the camps. For 3 days, those militias massacred civilians, men, women, children, the elderly. Between 800 and 3,500 people were killed. Israeli forces controlled the perimeter. They lit the camps with flares through the night. They received reports of what was happening and did not stop it. Israel's own government inquiry, the Kahan Commission, investigated and found that the Israeli military bore indirect responsibility for the massacre, and that Defense Minister Ariel Sharon bore personal responsibility for failing to prevent it. Sharon was forced to resign. In Israel, 400,000 people, roughly 10% of the entire population, took to the streets in protest. It was the largest demonstration in Israeli history at that point. Reagan was shaken. He sent American Marines to Lebanon as part of an international peacekeeping force. In October 1983, a Hezbollah truck bomb killed 241 of them. The United States retreated from Lebanon in humiliation. And yet, paradoxically, the relationship deepened, because the lesson Reagan drew was not that Israel was a liability. It was that the region was dangerous and unstable, and America needed Israel more than ever. By 1983, Reagan had signed National Security Decision Directive 111, formally designating Israel as a strategic partner. Intelligence sharing was expanded again. Military aid increased. Pre-positioning agreements were signed, allowing American military equipment to be stored on Israeli soil for use in regional emergencies. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the US-Israel relationship had been transformed from a moral commitment into a full military and strategic alliance, with the infrastructure, the legal frameworks, and the financial transfers that continue to this day. Meanwhile, the Palestinian people under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza watched. In December 1987, they began the First Intifada, a popular uprising against Israeli military occupation fought largely with stones by young people who had been born into a military occupation and had never known anything else. The occupation was now 20 years old. The Camp David promise of autonomy had long been buried. America barely noticed. So here is where we are at the end of the Cold War. America had started with Truman, a president who recognized Israel 11 minutes after it declared independence, driven by a mixture of personal conviction, political calculation, and moral belief in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The Palestinians who lost their homes that same year had no seat at the table. 40 years later, America was airlifting military equipment to Israel mid-conflict. It was signing formal strategic alliances. It was storing weapons on Israeli soil. It was vetoing UN resolutions, absorbing oil shocks, and sending Marines to the Middle East. And it was standing largely silent while Palestinian civilians were killed in refugee camps, as Israel's own government confirmed. The transformation had been driven by 3 things: the Cold War, which made Israel strategically valuable, the wars, 1967, 1973, which proved Israel's military power and cemented the logic, and the peace deals, above all Camp David, which showed that the alliance could reshape the region in America's favor. But there was a 4th element that the Cold War alone doesn't explain, and that's money, lobbying, Congress. The political infrastructure that was being built throughout this entire period, quietly, legally, and with enormous effect. By 1990, the question was no longer why does America back Israel? The question was, could it ever stop? That's part 2. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.